I stood at the airport curb, suitcase in one hand, phone in the other, watching reunion after reunion while my own son left me in the cold. 47 minutes. No call, no apology, just silence. He knew I was flying in. I reminded him twice. I used to move heaven and earth for him. Now he couldn't even cross town. So the next morning, I moved something too. His name off my accounts. We're about to begin, but if you'd like, share where you're joining from. It reminds me this story doesn't echo into silence. It lands somewhere real. Drop it in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe. The wheels of the plane screeched against the runway, jolting Helen Whitmore forward in her seat. She pressed her palm against the armrest, steadying herself as the cabin erupted in the usual shuffle, seatbelts unclicking, overhead, bins slamming, passengers jostling to grab coats and carry-ons. Helen didn't rush. At 70, she had learned patience wasn't weakness, it was survival. She reached for her canvas tote and the rolling suitcase tucked under the seat. Her sister in Phoenix had insisted on sending her home with an extra bundle of pecan cookies and crocheted potholders, packed with the same urgency as though Helen were a college kid heading back to a dorm. By the time she walked off the jet bridge into Cincinnati, Northern Kentucky Airport, the late March air had already begun to seep through the automatic doors, a sharp, wet cold that smelled faintly of jet fuel and rain. She tugged her coat tighter and pulled her phone from her purse. Text sent, 4:12 p.m. Just landed. You close? She wheeled her bag to the curbside pickup zone, the wind cutting through her gloves. Families reunited around her. Squeals, hugs, the slap of palms meeting shoulders. Helen smiled faintly at the sight, though her own corner of the sidewalk felt unusually still. She checked her phone. No reply. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. She shifted her weight from one foot to the other, trying not to look like someone who'd been forgotten. The cold gnawed its way into her knees. A plane roared overhead, drowning out her sigh. Text sent, 4:27 p.m. Standing outside B12. Traffic bad? Her phone remained stubbornly silent. At the 20-minute mark, she called. Straight to voicemail. The recorded message was brisk, detached. Greg's voice, but emptied of warmth. She hesitated, then hung up without leaving one. By 4:45, she'd resorted to pacing. Every car that slowed made her straighten expectantly, only to deflate when the driver leaned across the seat to greet someone else. She watched a college kid leap into her boyfriend's arms, a businessman clap his buddy on the back, an elderly couple wave as their daughter's SUV pulled in. Helen's phone buzzed in her hand. Her heart kicked, only to falter again when she saw the banner. Uber alert. Surge pricing active in your area. She swallowed the lump rising in her throat. Greg knew she was flying home today. She had reminded him twice. He had promised. Don't worry, Mom. I'll swing by. Easy. By 5:10, the ache in her back was unbearable. She dragged her suitcase to a bench, brushed away a thin layer of grit, and sat. Her fingers shook slightly as she opened the rideshare app. The screen flashed a warning. High demand. Estimated fare, $67, not including tip. Helen exhaled sharply through her nose. It wasn't the money. She had budgeted carefully, kept her accounts neat. It was the principle, the indignity of waiting, invisible in the swirl of headlights, while her son, her only son, couldn't be bothered to answer a call. A black sedan pulled up 10 minutes later. The driver, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, loaded her suitcase into the trunk. Helen slid into the back seat, the warmth of the heater hitting her face like a rebuke. As they pulled away from the terminal, she glanced back through the fogged window. A thought pressed in, sharper than the cold she'd endured outside. If Greg could leave me stranded here, what else was he capable of leaving me to face alone? The question followed her into the darkening city, an unwelcome passenger in the back seat. The next morning, sunlight slanted through the blinds of Helen's Oakley townhouse, a pale stripe across her kitchen table. She sat with her hands wrapped around a mug of chamomile tea, the steam rising into the silence. Her suitcase still leaned unopened against the hallway wall. The cookies and crocheted potholders remained inside, like gifts addressed to someone else. Her phone buzzed, the screen lit with Greg's name. "Hey, Mom." His voice carried the brisk tone of a man calling between meetings, as if she were one more item on his list. "Sorry about last night. Things just ran long." Helen closed her eyes, steadying her breath. She imagined him in his sleek condo kitchen, Bluetooth earpiece snug, Amanda gliding past behind him with that faintly dismissive smile. "That's all right," she said evenly. "I figured it out." Greg chuckled lightly, already shifting away. "Good, good. Glad you got home okay." The line clicked. No pause, no question about how long she had waited, no hint of contrition. Just gone. A minute later, a text arrived from Amanda. "Hope the trip was restful," complete with a smiley face that felt pasted on like a price tag. Helen stared at the words until they blurred, then set the phone face down. She looked around her small, tidy home. Everything in its place: lace curtains, the worn oak table, the row of framed school portraits from her years as a secretary, each class smiling in identical postures. It was safe, yes, but it was also quiet. Too quiet. The ache she had felt at the curbside yesterday pressed against her again, low and dull, like a bruise touched twice. A knock sounded at the door, 3 solid raps, then a familiar voice. "Helen? You home?" She pushed herself up, grateful for the interruption. Opening the door, she found Tom Vasquez standing with a casserole dish wrapped in foil. He grinned, his cheeks ruddy from the cold. "Chicken and rice. My daughter insists I make extras or else I'd eat frozen dinners all week," he said. Helen smiled, genuine this time. "You always bring too much, Tom." "Too much is better than not enough." He stepped inside, stamping snow from his boots. "So, how is Phoenix? See your sister?" They settled at the table. Tom's dish sent up warm, savory steam, filling the kitchen with a comfort Helen hadn't realized she needed. She told him briefly about the desert air, her sister's garden, the small comforts of family who asked and actually listened. But when Tom asked how her return trip went, her words caught. She took a sip of tea, then said it quietly. "Greg never showed at the airport." Tom's eyebrows rose. "Never showed?" She shook her head, looking down at her folded hands. "I waited. Over an hour. Ended up calling a rideshare." Tom leaned back, arms crossed, his expression darkening. "You don't say." "He called this morning." Her lips tightened. "Said things ran long." A sharp breath escaped Tom. He tapped his fingers against the table, a steady drumbeat of disapproval. Finally, he said, "Helen, don't let that slide." His voice had weight, the kind of firm counsel that carried decades of experience. He had been an accountant, meticulous by nature, and he still had a knack for spotting imbalance, not just in numbers, but in people. Helen tried to laugh it off, but it came out thin. "He's busy. Always has been." "Busy doesn't leave your mother standing in the cold," Tom said flatly. "That's not busy, that's disregard." The word hung in the kitchen, sharper than the scent of baked chicken. Helen didn't reply. Instead, she traced the rim of her mug with one finger, her mind circling back to the cold curb, the fogged car window, the silence on the phone. When Tom left a half-hour later, casserole portioned and plates stacked in the sink, Helen lingered by the door after closing it. Her phone still lay on the table, Amanda's chirpy text glowing faintly on the lock screen. She picked it up, thumb hovering. Delete? Reply? Neither seemed satisfying. She set it back down, firmer this time. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters. Helen crossed to the window and watched the bare branches shake against the pale gray sky. Something stirred in her chest. Not anger exactly. Not yet. But something weightier than disappointment. Tom's words replayed, steady as a heartbeat. Don't let that slide. Helen stood very still, as though the decision she hadn't made yet was already in motion, just waiting for her to claim it. The morning air was brittle when Helen stepped out of her townhouse, scarf looped tight against her throat. She locked the door with deliberate care, the metal key cool between her fingers. Sleep had been fitful, Tom's words circling her mind like a refrain she couldn't mute. Don't let that slide. The phrase had settled in her like grit in a shoe. Small, irritating, impossible to ignore. By the time she pushed open the glass doors of the First Regional Bank on Madison Road, she already knew she wasn't here to make excuses. Inside, the air smelled faintly of printer ink and lemon polish. A few customers milled about, heads bent over withdrawal slips. Helen spotted Jill Lee behind the counter, dark hair pulled back, glasses slipping slightly down her nose as she typed. Jill looked up, and her expression softened immediately. "Mrs. Whitmore, good morning." Helen managed a small smile. "Morning, Jill. Do you have a moment?" "Of course. Let's step into my office." They crossed into the quiet back room, where a framed photo of Jill's two little boys grinned from a shelf above neatly stacked binders. Helen sat, clutching her handbag a little too tightly. Jill slid behind the desk and clicked her mouse. "So, what can I help you with today?" Helen hesitated, then said, "I'd like to go over my account activity, just to make sure everything looks right." Jill nodded, fingers moving quickly over the keyboard. A few seconds later, a list of transactions filled the screen. Numbers scrolled, neat black text against a pale background. Helen's breath hitched when her eyes caught one particular line. Withdrawal, $5,000. 3 days ago. Online transfer. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I didn't do that." Jill adjusted her glasses, her brow knitting. "It was processed through an authorized online login." She glanced at Helen gently, choosing her words with care. "Does anyone else have your access information?" Helen closed her eyes briefly. Just in case. That's what she had told herself when Greg asked last year, standing in her kitchen, convincing, insistent. "You never know, Mom. What if something happens to you and I need to help with bills?" She had wanted to believe he was being thoughtful. Now the memory curdled. "My son," she said quietly. "I gave him access. I shouldn't have." Jill leaned forward, her tone low, calm. "Then let's fix it today. We can shut that down, remove his permissions, and reset everything with new credentials." Helen's pulse thudded in her ears. For a moment she imagined Greg's reaction, the annoyance in his voice, the clipped, "Mom, why are you overreacting?" That always made her feel small. But she wasn't small. Not here, not now. She straightened in her chair. "Yes, I'd like to reset everything." Jill gave a reassuring nod and began the process. Keys clicked, forms printed, signatures scrawled. With each step, Helen felt a little lighter, as though the very act of reclaiming her accounts was reclaiming a part of herself she hadn't realized she'd ceded. Finally, Jill handed her a folder of fresh paperwork. "Greg is no longer listed as an authorized user. New login, new passwords. Only you." Helen exhaled slowly, her shoulders dropping. "Thank you." Jill's eyes softened. "It's not easy, I know, but this is the right move." Helen folded the papers into her handbag, her fingers brushing the worn leather. For the first time in months, maybe years, she felt the faintest edge of control return. As she rose to leave, a thought pushed at her. Unbidden, unwelcome, but insistent. If Greg had taken $5,000 without asking, how many other times had he dipped his hand into her savings while she trusted him not to? The question followed her out into the cold as the bank doors hissed shut behind her, clinging closer than the chill of the wind. Helen returned home with the bank folder pressed tight against her chest, as though the papers inside were fragile glass that might shatter if she let them go. The townhouse was quiet, the kind of quiet that made small sounds, the tick of the kitchen clock, the creak of the floorboards, feel accusatory. She set her handbag on the table and slid the folder free. The pages inside were crisp, neatly ordered, and coldly factual. Numbers didn't lie, she knew. People did. Her eyes scanned the first page. Transfers. Always under 10,000. Always spaced just far enough apart to avoid attention. $4,200 here. $6,500 there. A cluster of $3,000 withdrawals spread like breadcrumbs across the calendar. Helen turned the page, her chest tightening. Over 24 months, the amount stacked higher and higher until the sum leapt off the page like a headline, $28,000. Her breath left her in a sharp exhale. $28,000. Nearly the cost of her townhouse mortgage back when she first bought it with her late husband. More than she had ever kept in her checking account at one time. More than enough to prove this wasn't forgetfulness or an innocent slip. Her mind started filling in the gaps with memories. Greg, leaning in her doorway 2 summers ago, his voice smooth as cream. "The HVAC system's shot, Mom. Just a bridge loan. I'll pay it back before you notice." Another time, last winter. His voice thick with frustration. "Amanda's job cut hours, and we're stretched thin. I just need a little help till things even out." Or the night he stopped by unannounced, tossing his keys on her counter like he owned the place. "Just for the weekend, Mom. I swear." Each excuse had sounded reasonable on its own, softened by his familiar grin, his practiced charm. But laid out here, in tidy rows of black ink and dollar signs, the pattern screamed something else. Entitlement. Helen's throat tightened as she quietly fed the printer command, page after page sliding into the tray. Each sheet that emerged was damning, more permanent than memory, more brutal than her son's casual explanations. She stacked them in a neat pile, fingers trembling only once before she steadied them. By the time the last page printed, her decision had hardened. This wasn't something she could shoulder alone. Not anymore. That evening, she carried the stack next door, casserole dish in hand as pretense. Tom answered with his usual warmth, but when she laid the papers on his table, his eyes sharpened. He slipped on his reading glasses, scanning line after line without speaking. When he finished, he whistled low, a sound of disbelief that quickly soured into anger. "He's been bleeding you dry, Helen, and he's been smart about it. Always under reporting thresholds, always with excuses ready." Helen folded her hands together, her knuckles white. "I thought I was helping him." Tom shook his head, voice firm but not unkind. "Helping is a gift. This is theft wearing a polite smile." He tapped the top page. "You need someone who can put this into perspective, legally. I know a woman downtown, Delia Grant, estate attorney, sharp as a tack. She'll know what these numbers really mean." The next morning, Helen found herself in Delia's office. The space was crisp and professional. Mahogany desk, shelves lined with thick legal volumes, a vase of fresh tulips brightening the window. Delia herself was composed, her silver hair pulled into a smooth bun, her eyes sharp but not unkind. Helen slid the stack of pages across the desk. "It's my son," she admitted softly. "He's been taking from me. I thought I was keeping track, but—" Her voice cracked. "It's worse than I realized." Delia adjusted her glasses and began leafing through the log with measured precision. Not a flicker of shock crossed her face, only a steady narrowing of the eyes as she traced each number with her pen. After a long moment, she looked up. Mrs. Whitmore, this isn't a misunderstanding. This is a pattern. And if it's been going on this long, it's time you decide. Are you prepared to treat it like one? Helen's pulse quickened. The words settled like a challenge across the polished wood between them. Helen sat rigid in Delia Grant's office, the soft hum of the HVAC filling the silence between them. The attorney's words still echoed, precise and unyielding. This is a pattern. Are you prepared to treat it like one? For the first time in years, Helen didn't default to defending her son. She didn't reach for excuses, didn't soften her voice with the familiar, "He's just busy," or "things are tight for him right now." Instead, she heard her own pulse steadying, the faint drumbeat of resolve. "I am," she said finally. Delia's sharp gaze didn't waver. "Then here's where we start." She pulled a legal pad close and began sketching out steps in clean, angular handwriting. "Your retirement accounts, your will, any trusts, current or future. Right now, Greg benefits from your hesitation. That ends today." Helen's breath caught, but she nodded. Within minutes, Delia had called in a paralegal who slid files across the mahogany desk. The paperwork looked sterile, impersonal, yet Helen felt the weight of every line. Her pen hovered above the first page. Greg's name appeared in black ink, neatly typed under beneficiaries. Her son, her only child. The boy she had raised through scraped knees and late homework, through the grief of losing his father, through the lean years when she'd counted coupons and stayed late at the school office just to keep the lights on. And now, here was proof, not in memory, but in money, that he had taken advantage of her trust. Helen pressed the pen down. With a deliberate stroke, she crossed him out. Her voice, though quiet, carried in the stillness of the office. "Remove him. Name the literacy nonprofit downtown instead. They've been asking for donations." Delia's lips twitched into the faintest smile of approval. Done. Next came her church scholarship fund. Helen signed her name with steady precision, picturing the students who would one day buy textbooks with these dollars. Not Greg. Not anymore. Finally, Delia slid forward a draft amendment for Helen's will. "You may leave him something symbolic, if you wish. $1 to show intent." Helen's pen didn't waver. She signed, leaving Greg exactly that, $1, nothing more. A strange calm settled into her chest, heavier than relief, but lighter than anger. It felt like closing a door she hadn't realized had been standing open for far too long. Delia filed the pages into neat stacks. "This is legally binding once I record it, effective immediately." Helen sat back, exhaling for what felt like the first time in days, the weight of years, of excuses, of self-blame, of quiet tolerance, slipped, piece by piece, off her shoulders. But Delia wasn't done. "There's still the matter of your savings." Helen looked up. "You have assets Greg cannot touch if we restructure them into a trust, a revocable one, with you as sole trustee. Do you want that security?" Helen's fingers brushed the worn strap of her handbag, the same one she'd carried for a decade. She thought of her late husband's voice, measured, practical, urging her to protect what they'd built together. She thought of Greg's easy grin, the way it had soured over the years into something transactional. "Yes," she said. By late afternoon, $120,000 had been transferred into a new trust. The paperwork bore only her name. No Greg, no Amanda, no loopholes. When Delia confirmed the documents were filed, Helen rose slowly, almost reverently. For the first time since Phoenix, since the airport curbside, since the discovery of the withdrawals, her chest felt open. Outside, the sky was pale, streaked with thin clouds. Helen walked to her car, folder tucked beneath her arm. The cold air nipped her cheeks, but it no longer felt biting. At a stoplight, she caught her reflection in the rearview mirror. Her eyes, lined with age, gleamed with something steadier than grief. Resolve. But as she pulled onto her street, a chill threaded its way back into her thoughts. Greg didn't yet know what she had done. He still believed she was his silent safety net, his quiet banker. And when he found out the truth, that he no longer controlled her money, her will, or her future, what would he do? The call came on a gray Thursday evening, just as Helen was settling into her recliner with a crossword. She saw Greg's name flash across the screen and felt her stomach tighten, not with anticipation, but with the grim certainty that this moment had been inevitable. She answered anyway. "Mom," Greg began, his tone smooth, too smooth. "Listen, I've had some unexpected expenses, just a little cash flow issue. Could you spot me for a bit?" Helen's grip on the phone tightened. She imagined the old version of herself, the one who would have hesitated, stammered, then caved. But that woman had walked into Delia's office and signed her name to new papers. That woman had died quietly the moment Greg lost his hold on her accounts. "I'm not comfortable with that anymore," she said evenly. A pause, then a short laugh, almost incredulous. "Not comfortable? Mom, it's me. You've always helped out. What's changed?" Helen sat straighter, the crossword sliding forgotten into her lap. "The balance, Greg. That's what's changed. I've done all the giving. It's time I stop pretending you'll ever make it right." For the first time, his voice cracked, sharpened. "You're overreacting. Families support each other." "Families don't drain each other," Helen replied, her tone as flat as the winter sky outside. There was a long silence, filled only by the faint hiss of the line. Then Greg muttered, "I don't even know who you are anymore," and hung up. Helen sat very still, phone cooling in her hand. The words stung, not because they were true, but because he meant them as punishment. He wanted her to feel guilty for changing the rules, for refusing to be his crutch. An hour later, her phone buzzed again, this time with a text from Amanda. "Greg said you turned him down. We all have obligations, Helen. Family comes first. I hope you remember that." No smiley face this time, just the barbed undertone of a woman who had stood silently behind her husband's excuses until now. Helen read the message once, her throat tightening, then pressed her thumb to the delete button. Gone. No reply. The townhouse seemed to exhale with her. The silence wasn't accusatory tonight. It was peaceful, almost approving. She rose, fetched a notepad from the drawer, and sat back at the kitchen table. With her pen poised, she began to write. Not a letter, not an apology, but a list. Debt, access, inheritance, control. Each word landed like a nail hammered into wood. Fixed, sealed, locked. Helen underlined the last word twice, then set the pen down. She stared at the list until the lines blurred, a strange calm settling over her. It wasn't just money she was protecting. It was herself, her autonomy, the dignity she had almost surrendered. But as she folded the paper and slid it into the back of her planner, another thought rose, sharper, darker. If Greg was already pressing after losing access, what would he do once he realized how completely the doors had been closed to him? She closed the planner with deliberate care, her hand lingering on the cover. Whatever storm Greg might bring, she was no longer standing unarmed at the curb, waiting. The glass doors of First Regional Bank slid open with a sharp hiss, and Greg Whitmore strode inside like he owned the place. His suit jacket was unbuttoned, his tie loosened, and his jaw was clenched so tight the receptionist instinctively shrank back. He ignored her greeting and cut straight toward the teller line. "Excuse me," he said, his voice pitched too loud for the hushed lobby. "I need to speak to someone in charge." Heads turned. A mother shifted her toddler higher on her hip. An elderly man in a cap looked up from his deposit slip, frowning. From behind the counter, Jill Lee emerged. She smoothed the skirt of her navy suit and offered a professional smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Mr. Whitmore, how can I help you today?" Greg leaned in, too close, his voice dropping into the practiced charm that had worked on plenty of colleagues, waiters, and women at cocktail bars. "I just need a printout of my mom's account. Balance, recent activity. You've got it right there." Jill's smile didn't falter, but her tone cooled. "I'm afraid you're not on the account anymore." The words landed with the quiet finality of a gavel. Greg blinked, caught off guard. "That's not right." "I've had access for years. She put me on for emergencies." "I understand," Jill said evenly, hands folded in front of her. "But as of last week, you were removed as an authorized user. Mrs. Whitmore made that decision." Color rose in Greg's face, a mottled red creeping up his neck. He straightened, voice climbing. "So what? She just cuts me out without saying a word? You can't do that without telling me." A ripple of discomfort moved through the lobby. Jill held her ground. "She can," and she did. "I'm sorry, Mr. Whitmore. There's nothing further I can provide you." For a moment, Greg's hand twitched toward the counter, as if he might slam his fist down. Instead, he spun on his heel. Muttering a curse under his breath, his polished shoes clicked hard against the tile as he stormed out, the automatic doors yawning open with a whoosh that seemed to underline his humiliation. Outside, the March wind hit him, cold and sharp. He yanked his phone from his pocket, thumb jabbing Helen's number. She answered on the third ring, her voice calm. "Greg." "You embarrassed me," he snapped, pacing beside his car. "I just walked into your bank, and they tell me I'm not even allowed to see the damn account. Do you have any idea how that looks? Like I'm some stranger off the street." Helen listened, letting his words tumble over each other, his anger trying to claw its way into her composure. When he finally paused for breath, she spoke, her tone measured. "Greg, you are a stranger, at least where my money is concerned. That's what you chose." He scoffed, disbelieving. "Don't talk like that. You don't mean it." "I do," Helen said quietly. The silence that followed was heavier than shouting. Greg's breathing was audible through the line, jagged and furious. Finally, he spat. "You've lost it, Mom. You're making a fool of yourself. And me." Then he hung up, leaving only the hollow buzz of the disconnected call. Helen lowered the phone slowly, her hand steady. She knew this wasn't the end. It was only the opening salvo. Greg wasn't just angry. He was wounded, humiliated. And humiliation, she knew, had a way of festering into something far more dangerous. She set the phone on the table, folded her hands in her lap, and let the silence stretch. Somewhere deep in her chest, beneath the ache and the fear, a new thought stirred. If Greg could storm into a bank and demand answers like that, what else might he try to take by force? The phone call with Greg had left no room for misunderstanding. His fury was clear. His disbelief, louder still. But what stayed with Helen, echoing into the silence of her townhouse, was not his voice. It was her own. Steady, unapologetic, final. For decades, she had cushioned his disappointments, absorbed his complaints, played the role of quiet fixer. She had bent herself into a kind of furniture in his life. Useful, reliable, overlooked. No more. On Saturday morning, she pulled out her stationery set, cream-colored paper embossed with her initials in faded gold. It had been a gift from her late husband on their 30th anniversary. Helen set the first sheet on the kitchen table, smoothed the edges flat with her palm, and uncapped a pen. Her hand hovered for a moment. Then the words began to flow, sharp and deliberate. "Greg, I've allowed myself to be used for too long. I see that now. You've treated my savings as your safety net, my patience as your permission. That ends today." She paused, listening to the steady tick of the clock. The pen tip didn't waver. I will not be your bank. I will not be your afterthought. Her chest rose and fell, and with each sentence, a weight shifted. You embarrassed yourself at the bank, not me. You weakened this family, not me. And I refuse to play the role you've written for me any longer. When she finished, she read the letter twice, trimming away any softness. No apologies, no bargaining, only truth. She signed the bottom with 2 firm initials, HW, and folded the page into a clean rectangle. That afternoon, she drove to Greg's sleek downtown condo. The streets gleamed wet from a light rain, traffic lights reflecting in red puddles. She parked half a block away, her heartbeat steady, her hands cool on the steering wheel. She didn't buzz his unit, didn't risk a confrontation. Instead, she walked briskly to the row of silver mailboxes at the building's entrance. The paper slid in easily, the sound of the flap snapping shut like a lock turning. No signature, no explanation. Just the truth. Waiting for him. Helen returned home lighter than she had left. She set water to boil, pulled a tea bag from the tin, and lit the stub of a lavender candle on her windowsill. The flame flickered against the glass, casting a warm halo. When she exhaled, it was not the weary sigh of someone bracing for the next demand. It was release. Later that evening, an envelope arrived in her mailbox. Inside, Jill had tucked a fresh debit card and a booklet of checks, each embossed with Helen's name alone. A sticky note, written in Jill's neat hand, read, "Clean slate." J. Helen held the new card between her fingers, its plastic sheen catching the candlelight. Clean slate. The words rang truer than Jill could have known. She set it carefully beside her teacup, folded her hands in her lap, and let the silence wrap around her. Not the accusatory quiet she had lived with for years, but the rare, unfamiliar kind that felt like peace. But even as she sipped the last of her tea, the lavender flame dancing low, a question stirred at the edges of her calm. When Greg opened that letter, stripped of her role in his story, would he retreat? Or would he come at her harder, more desperate than before? Monday morning dawned with a brittle sunlight, the kind that looked warm through the blinds but carried no heat when Helen stepped outside for her paper. She tucked it under her arm, made her tea, and opened the crossword. But the lavender calm she had felt after delivering her letter was gone. The unease had returned, sharper this time, gnawing at the edges of her quiet kitchen. It was the word that did it. Afterthought. She had written it herself, clear as ink, but now it lingered in her mind like a warning. Greg had always needed her to be more than a mother. He had needed her to be his guarantor, his fallback, his invisible co-signer. The thought jolted her. Co-signer. Heart beating faster, Helen fetched her laptop and sat at the table. She opened the credit bureau's site, fingers tapping stiffly on the keys. The process was clumsy, passwords reset, security questions answered. But at last the report loaded on the screen. She scanned the list once, then again, disbelief hardening into fury. There it was. A loan she had never taken, a credit card she had never swiped, a line of debt opened 5 years ago, tied neatly to both their names. Her name, without her knowledge. Helen pressed her hand to her mouth, the paper of her crossword crinkling beneath her palm. She remembered the signatures Greg had asked her to provide over the years. Just a form for work. Just an insurance thing. She had signed quickly, trusting him. Trusting her son. Now she saw the truth. He had used her not just as a bank, but as collateral. The fury steadied her. She picked up the phone and called Jill, who patched her directly to the bank's fraud department. Her voice didn't tremble as she explained, "No, I never consented. No, I was not present. Yes, I want this filed as fraud." The representative confirmed. "You'll be removed as cosigner, ma'am. We'll update the report once the claim is processed." By noon, she had signed affidavits, scanned IDs, and forwarded everything Delia told her to. The paper trail was undeniable. Greg had tied her credit to his, without her say-so. And now, that tether was cut. The fallout came fast. 2 days later, she heard from Tom, who had run into a mutual friend downtown. Greg and Amanda's mortgage application had been denied. Their credit had taken a sudden nosedive, and Amanda's parents had declined to help, apparently tired of being asked to bail them out. Helen pictured Amanda's tight smile, her barbed little texts, and almost laughed. Not cruelly, but with the raw edge of someone who had finally stepped out of a trap. For years, she had been the silent guarantor of Greg's life. The ghost who signed without question, the safety net beneath every leap. And now, with one fraud claim, that scaffolding was gone. That evening, Helen sat at her kitchen table again, the same spot where she had written her letter. She opened her planner, flipped past the page with her four-word list, and wrote a new phrase beneath it in careful block letters: "Clean break." She underlined it once, then closed the book. But as she moved through her quiet townhouse, setting the kettle to boil, she couldn't ignore the tightening coil in her chest. Greg had already seethed when she refused a loan. He had stormed into the bank when she cut his access. Now, his entire financial foundation had cracked beneath him. Helen poured her tea and carried it to the window. Outside, the bare trees rattled against the late winter wind. Somewhere in the city, her son was realizing just how thoroughly she had dismantled his control. And she knew, when he finally turned that fury toward her, it wouldn't be with pleading anymore. It would be with rage. Delia's office felt different this time. Not ominous, not overwhelming, but solid, like the walls themselves had become allies. Helen laid her planner on the desk, her notes folded inside. The phrase she'd written the night before, "clean break," seemed to hum beneath the leather cover. Delia adjusted her glasses, her tone brisk but not unkind. "You're ready to finalize the trust?" Helen nodded. "Yes, ready." The paperwork was already stacked neatly, each section flagged with yellow tabs. The legal language was dense, but Delia walked her through every clause with the patience of someone who understood the stakes. When they reached the section on beneficiaries, Helen braced herself. Greg's name was nowhere on the page, not even as a footnote. Instead, Delia read aloud the new designation. Successor trustee, Ms. Danielle Cooper, age 27. Currently pursuing a master's in education. Helen smiled faintly. She remembered Danielle, shy at 14, scribbling poems in the back row of the school office while waiting for her mother to finish a late custodial shift. Helen had nudged her into entering the county's essay contest, and Danielle had won first place. She was one of the good ones, Helen said softly. Steady. Kind. She won't let herself be pushed around. Exactly the kind of trustee you want, Delia agreed. Helen signed, her pen scratching firmly across the page. The act didn't feel vengeful. It felt clarifying, like wiping fog from a mirror. This wasn't about punishing Greg anymore. It was about ensuring her life's work went where it mattered, into steady hands, not grasping ones. When the last signature dried, Delia gathered the papers. "It's done," she said simply. Helen exhaled, long and slow. The knot in her chest loosened. On the way home, she stopped at the grocery store and wrote 3 checks at the service counter, one each for the neighborhood food banks that had helped her and her late husband in the lean years. She filled out the memo line carefully, in memory of Robert Whitmore. As she handed them over, a warmth spread through her chest. Not triumph. Not victory. Something steadier. Continuity. That evening, Helen sat in the community center's multi-purpose room with half a dozen other seniors, a stack of workbooks open on the table. The class title was plain, Estate Literacy for Older Adults, but the energy in the room was anything but. Men and women traded stories of being taken advantage of confusing paperwork, of lessons learned too late. Helen listened, contributed, and for the first time in weeks, didn't feel like a victim scrambling to catch up. She was part of something, prepared, alert, awake. During a break, she jotted in the margin of her workbook, clarity, not revenge. The words steadied her more than tea or candlelight ever could. Back at home, she brewed a pot anyway, chamomile, fragrant, and calming. She moved through the townhouse with practiced ease, setting her planner on the counter, sliding tonight's notes beside it. The house was hers again, every corner free of Greg's shadow. But as she set her mug down and glanced out the window, she caught sight of her reflection in the glass. Her eyes looked clear, steady, and yet, in the dark beyond the pane, she couldn't shake the feeling of something pressing closer. Greg didn't know about the trust yet, about Danielle's name, about the checks written in his father's memory. And when he did, when he realized not just what he'd lost, but who had taken the pen away from him, it wouldn't be silence she'd hear on the other end of the line. It would be something louder. The brochure had arrived in her mailbox, tucked between a utility bill and a coupon booklet. Glossy cardstock, cheerful fonts, Oak Haven Senior Cooperative, independent living for independent spirits. Helen almost tossed it into the recycling bin, but the phrase caught her. Independent spirits. She folded it neatly and placed it on the counter beside her planner. By the next morning, she was dialing the number. 2 weeks later, she stood in the lobby of Oak Haven, a modest 3-story complex on the edge of town. Sunlight spilled through wide windows, warming the hardwood floors. A receptionist offered her coffee, then guided her into a tour group of half a dozen retirees. The halls smelled faintly of lemon wax and fresh bread from the communal kitchen. Helen lingered at the window of a common lounge, where 2 women played cards, while another group set out folding chairs for a film night. Outside, she glimpsed walking paths curling through groves of maple trees, benches tucked beneath their branches. A small lake shimmered beyond, geese drifting lazily across its surface. The director explained the structure: co-op ownership, shared governance, monthly dues pooled for maintenance. Helen nodded, listening carefully, though her mind kept circling back to a single thought. Here, no one waits for someone else who never comes. Here, everyone carries their own weight. In the sample unit, she trailed her fingers across the wide windowsill. Light poured in, clean and unbroken. Not a shadow of Greg's demands, not a trace of Amanda's clipped messages. Just quiet, purposeful space. That night, she filled out the waitlist application and tucked the confirmation receipt into her planner. 2 years, maybe less, and she would sell the townhouse. Oak Haven would be her next home. It wasn't retreat. It was a plan. The following Saturday, she joined a walking club that met at Eden Park. The pace was easy, the chatter lively. A retired nurse recounted her cross-country road trip. A widower explained his passion for birdwatching. Helen matched their steps, her lungs filling with crisp air, her heart lighter with each lap around the path. She also signed up for a volunteer tutoring program at the library. Her first student was a boy of 9, struggling with multiplication. His frustration reminded her of afternoons in the school office when she'd coax children through homework while they waited for late pickups. She guided him patiently, smiling when his brow smoothed and the answer clicked into place. "These numbers," she told him gently, tapping his worksheet, "are only puzzles. Once you see the pattern, they stop being scary." Walking home that evening, Helen realized the words applied to more than math: patterns, choices. She had spent years ignoring the patterns Greg left in his wake, excusing them as accidents. But once she'd seen them clearly, they weren't frightening anymore, just puzzles she had finally solved. In the weeks that followed, She met others at the co-op meetings, men and women who had been caretakers, givers, forgivers. They traded stories of adult children who had leaned too hard, of relatives who saw them as wallets or spare bedrooms. The stories were painful, but no one sat in bitterness. They were here to plan forward, not backward. Helen found herself laughing more than she expected. Not brittle laughter, not the tired kind that covered a wince, but genuine. She hadn't realized how long it had been since she'd felt that ease. Back at her townhouse, she planted a small pot of basil on her kitchen windowsill, a reminder that life could still grow fresh even in old containers. She flipped open her planner, added a new heading beneath her lists, Future. But as she closed it again, a flicker of unease threaded the quiet. She could build her plans. She could walk her paths. She could surround herself with steady people. But Greg's world was unraveling at the same time hers was knitting back together. And sooner or later, she suspected, those two directions would collide. The news didn't come directly from Greg. It never did anymore. It came from Tom, who leaned across the fence one afternoon while Helen was clipping dead stems from her garden pots. "Ran into Donnelly at the grocery," Tom said, lowering his voice. "Your boy's in trouble at work. Something about irregularities in the accounts." Helen set her shears down, brushing dirt from her gloves. She didn't feign surprise. He lost his job. Then, Tom gave a solemn nod. That evening, Helen pictured the sleek downtown office Greg used to brag about, the tailored suits, the business cards he handed out like candy. All gone now. By the weekend, Amanda's voice began to trickle into the story through mutual friends. She'd taken a part-time job at a boutique, her brittle politeness stretched thin over resentment. She shouldn't have to be doing this. Not at her age, someone reported Amanda had said. Helen imagined her saying it in that tight, precise tone, anger disguised as propriety. At the library, Helen overheard the rest from a former colleague in the tutoring program. "They're blaming you, you know," the woman whispered, glancing around as though Greg might appear in the children's section. Helen raised her brows. "Of course they are. They'd blame anyone but themselves." Her voice carried no bitterness, only clarity. She adjusted the stack of budgeting worksheets she had prepared for her teens and turned the conversation back to them. That week's lesson was on needs versus wants. Helen sketched circles on the whiteboard in the library's small classroom. Needs are your rent, your groceries, your health. Wants are sneakers with 3 stripes instead of 2. The kids laughed, but they listened. She leaned on the desk, her tone steady. "The trick is not letting your wants eat your needs." As she spoke, she thought of Greg, how he had let wants chew through everything until nothing of need remained. News of his decline arrived in fragments. The car? First. His pride and joy, a glossy black sedan, sold off in a hurry. Then the condo, that sleek glass box downtown, listed at a price that reeked of desperation. Helen saw the listing one evening when she idly typed his name into the search bar. The photographs were sterile, staged, rooms stripped of warmth, the kitchen counters bare. It looked less like a home than a showroom being dismantled. She closed the browser tab without lingering. Her life, meanwhile, pressed forward with quiet steadiness. She walked twice a week with her club, rain or shine. She tutored 2 more students, their confidence blooming across the pages of their notebooks. She started a small budgeting workshop for adults, too, after one of the librarians asked if she'd consider it. In each of these rooms, she carried herself lighter, steadier, no longer waiting for Greg's shadow to interrupt. But late one evening, while setting out lesson plans, Helen paused at her window. Across the street, the dark branches swayed in the wind. She thought of Greg packing boxes, Amanda muttering over bills, the tight coil of anger growing with each loss. Helen pressed her planner shut, her hand firm on its cover. His status was crumbling, his privileges evaporating, his excuses running out. And with each brick that fell from the life he had built, Helen knew the rubble would not stay contained. It would come tumbling toward her doorstep sooner or later. Helen had always believed numbers told the truth. Faces could lie, voices could charm, but numbers stood stubborn and plain. So one Sunday morning, with rain pressing softly against her windows, she pulled out the stack of printed bank records she had once carried to Tom's kitchen. She spread them across her table in careful rows, each withdrawal, each transfer, each small cut that had bled her account dry. She sharpened a pencil, drew neat underlines, and began compiling her own ledger. Line by line, the theft became undeniable. $4,200, June. $6,500, September. $3,000, January. All dressed in Greg's excuses. The HVAC's gone. Amanda's hours were cut, just until Friday. She totaled the figures, her pencil steady, her breath calm. $28,000. Helen sat back, staring at the number. She thought of her late husband, Robert, how they had saved dollar by dollar, paycheck by paycheck, clipping coupons and forgoing vacations so they'd never owe more than they could pay. She thought of Greg as a boy, his allowance carefully tallied in a notebook, his first savings bond tucked into a card. Somewhere along the way, the boy who had once marveled at the value of $5 crisp had grown into a man who thought $28,000 was his mother's obligation. Helen turned to a fresh sheet of stationery. Not flowery, not emotional. Just facts. Greg, enclosed is an itemized record of every transfer you've made from my accounts. Total, $28,000. Not one repayment, not one apology. You called them loans, but they were thefts wearing excuses. She paused, pencil poised, then added the line that had been waiting for her, quiet and steady. I already fixed your future. You broke it again. No anger, no plea, just the truth. She clipped the letter to the ledger, slid everything into a manila envelope, and sealed it shut. On the front, in neat block letters, she wrote his name. Then she added a smaller note on a separate slip of paper, just 4 words. This is your balance. She slipped it inside before sealing. The next morning, Helen drove to the post office. She stood at the counter, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead, and asked for certified mail. The clerk stamped the form, slid her the receipt, and handed back the envelope with its green tracking sticker. Helen placed it carefully into the outgoing bin. She didn't watch it disappear into the back room. She simply turned, lifted her chin, and walked out. Days passed. No reply, no angry call, no flurry of texts. Through Tom, she heard whispers of Greg's condo being stripped bare, Amanda snapping at realtors, arguments echoing down their hall. But Greg himself said nothing. Helen pictured him opening the envelope, seeing his own thefts laid out in stark black lines, each one undeniable, each excuse nailed to the page. She imagined his silence not as guilt but as strategy, a man who had finally run out of spin. But in that silence, Helen found her own closure. She had not screamed, she had not begged. She had simply returned the record to him, clean and cold, like a mirror held to his face. That evening, she sat with her tutoring students, walking them through their first mock budgets. You can't pretend money isn't real, she told them gently. It always tells the truth. Later, when the library lights dimmed and she stepped out into the cool night, Helen felt lighter than she had in months. Not triumphant, not vindictive, just steady. But as she turned onto her street, headlights flashed in her rearview mirror, bright, unblinking, following closer than was necessary. Helen's hands tightened on the wheel. When she pulled into her driveway, the car behind her didn't slow. It passed, tires hissing on wet pavement, and disappeared around the corner. Still, she sat in the car a long moment before going inside. Her pulse had quickened, her chest tight. Silence from Greg wasn't peace, It was the kind of quiet that comes before something breaks. The envelope was cream-colored, addressed by hand in a looping script. It arrived on a Tuesday morning among catalogs and utility bills, and Helen nearly missed it. She slid it open with her kitchen knife, and the words inside stopped her mid-breath. Dear Mrs. Whitmore, your generous contribution has allowed us to complete the new reading room at the Cincinnati Literacy Center. We've named it in your honor. The plaque reads, "Built by someone who never stopped learning. Please join us for a small dedication ceremony this Friday." The letter trembled in her hand, not from weakness but from the force of something swelling inside her, gratitude, astonishment, and a quiet vindication. All the years she had been reduced in her son's eyes to a balance sheet, here she was, remembered for something entirely different. On Friday, she stood outside the Literacy Center, its brick facade glowing in the afternoon sun. A cluster of staff and volunteers waited by the entrance, smiles warm and genuine. When they ushered her into the new reading room, she paused on the threshold. Light spilled through tall windows onto shelves stacked with brand new books. Dictionaries, novels, math guides, story collections for children. Tables gleamed, unscarred by years of use, waiting for the marks of pencils and learning, and there it was, the plaque, mounted by the door in burnished bronze, built by someone who never stopped learning. Helen's eyes prickled. She traced the raised letters with her fingertips, the cool metal steady under her touch. "Mrs. Whitmore," the director said, smiling beside her. "This will help thousands of students over the years. You've given more than money. You've given opportunity." Helen swallowed past the lump in her throat and nodded, unable to say more than, "Thank you for letting me see this." Outside afterward, Cody bounded up the sidewalk. Her great-nephew had driven down from Dayton just for the ceremony. He was tall now, lanky, with a college sweatshirt tugged over his frame and that restless grin of the young. "Aunt Helen!" He wrapped her in a quick hug that nearly knocked the air out of her. "This is incredible. They named it after you? You're famous." She laughed, genuine and light. "Hardly famous, but it feels good to see something lasting." He tugged her toward the flower beds by the entrance, where staff had left trays of marigolds and petunias. "They said we could help plant these, make the place more welcoming." Kneeling beside him, Helen dug her fingers into the cool soil, the scent of earth rich and grounding. Cody hummed tunelessly as he pressed a marigold into place, his hair falling into his eyes. "You still write checks, Aunt Helen?" he teased, brushing dirt from his hands. "Everyone my age just taps their phone." Helen chuckled, patting soil around a bloom. "Only the ones that count." The two of them worked until their hands were smudged and the beds blazed with color. For a moment, Helen allowed herself to rest back on her heels, surveying the bright scatter of flowers, the plaque gleaming, the building standing sturdy and alive with promise. This was legacy. Not money siphoned away in secret transfers, not condos or cars destined for auction, not the endless cycle of excuses she'd endured. But pages waiting to be turned, young hands gripping pencils, letters forming into words. She brushed her palms together and stood, the ache in her knees tempered by the satisfaction in her chest. But as Cody loaded the empty trays into his car, Helen's gaze lingered on the street beyond. A sedan slowed at the corner, its windows tinted dark, its engine idling longer than necessary before it turned and drove away. The smile on her face didn't falter for Cody's sake, but inside, her chest tightened. Greg had fallen silent for weeks now. No calls, no replies, just absence. But she could feel it. That silence wasn't surrender. It was gathering, like storm clouds out of sight, waiting for the right moment to break. The card arrived on a Wednesday, slipped between a flyer for gutter cleaning and an envelope from her utility company. Helen knew the handwriting instantly, Greg's hurried scrawl, letters leaning forward as if trying to outrun themselves. She didn't open it. Instead, she carried it to the shredder she'd bought last fall, fed the envelope in unopened, and watched the blades chew it into thin ribbons. The sound was quick, final, satisfying. No apologies could erase the ledger she'd mailed. No pleas could restore what he had dismantled. When the machine stilled, Helen brushed her hands together as if shaking off the last dust of obligation. That evening, she did something she hadn't done in decades. She booked herself a trip. A weekend in the Blue Ridge Mountains. Just her, a cabin rental, and the quiet stretch of sky above the ridges. She clicked confirm before she could overthink. Before old instincts whispered she should save the money for someone else's need. The following Friday, she drove south, the miles unspooling beneath her like a ribbon leading away from every storm she had weathered. Her suitcase held little more than sturdy shoes, a thermos, and her leather-bound journal. The cabin was small, perched at the edge of a trailhead. No television, no buzzing appliances, only the whisper of wind through the pines and the call of a distant hawk. Helen set her bag on the bed, breathed in the resin-sweet air, and felt something in her chest loosen. The next morning, she laced her boots and set out before sunrise. The trail wound upward, pine needles crunching beneath her steps. Each switchback lifted her higher, away from the hum of roads, away from the clatter of expectation. Halfway up, she paused, pulling her journal from her pack. On a flat rock, she sat and wrote. Not about Greg, not about the years of giving until she was empty, but about what came next. Oak Haven, the tutoring program, the garden in spring. Words filled the page in looping lines, steady and unhurried. When she reached the summit, the world opened before her. The mountains stretched endless, their folds washed in the gold of morning light. Clouds drifted low, soft as smoke. Helen stood at the edge, wind tugging at her coat, and spread her hands as if to prove to herself they were empty. No bank folders, no receipts, no phone buzzing with demands. Empty and full, all at once. She closed her eyes, breathing in the clean air, the kind that tasted like freedom. For years she had carried silence like a burden, swallowing words to keep the peace. Now silence arrived as a gift, wrapping her in stillness so complete it made her eyes sting. Her lips parted, and the words slipped out, barely louder than the wind. Thank you for leaving me behind. It wasn't a curse. It wasn't even bitter. It was gratitude, raw and unvarnished. Greg had abandoned her at the airport curb, humiliated her in lobbies and phone calls, siphoned her accounts dry, but in doing so, he had forced her to build a life where she owed nothing to anyone but herself. She sank onto a boulder, journal across her knees, and wrote the sentence she hadn't known was waiting. He left me at the curb, and I left him at the vault. The line glowed on the page, steady and unshakable. Helen closed the journal, pressed it to her chest, and lifted her gaze to the horizon. The mountains held their silence, vast and unjudging. For the first time in a long time, Helen didn't feel small in the world. She felt placed, right where she was meant to be. He left me at the curb, and I left him at the vault.